student of limited means and didn't qualify for caste quotas this academic session, the government says that you can have a leg up in 40,000 colleges and 900 universities. So you should be rejoicing, right? With the 10% quotas opening up for the very first time, the promise of elite education in even private universities that have till now not catered to any kind of quotas. But on Reality Check today, we look at whether it is that simple. Now, the Education Minister says, just like Pranab Mukherjee said when the OBC reservation was introduced years ago, that the number of seats in the other quotas will not be impacted in real terms at all. They will just add extra seats to accommodate the new quota students. As many others have pointed out before, what's ironic is that those that criticized quotas till now and advocated for meritocracy are now beneficiaries of the same. So let's just look at the numbers game till now, and this is according to an IIT professor that we spoke to about how they all worked out how many seats post the reservation. So if we just have those numbers on the graphics up on the screen, what we can see right now is at that time, before the OBC reservation came in, at that time you just had this. You had 77.5% for general category, 7.5% for scheduled tribes, and 15% for scheduled castes. So when they brought it in 2006, 2007, when the 27% OBC quota was brought in, at that time, what they did was they increased, suppose you had 100 seats at that time, they increased it to 154. So the percentage of seats for all groups remained undisturbed. And the percentage of seats for the general category remained 77% as such. So that was the calculation at that time. Now let's look at what the minister has said this time round. At this time round, they haven't described to us the modalities of it. What they are saying is that if you have an existing 100 seats, if you're a private university, a private college, you have 100 seats, you will have to, in order to accommodate the 10% new quota and yet not impact others, then you will have to increase your existing 100 seats. You have to share those resources for 125. But what that calculation is, unlike the previous one, we don't know. But that's what we've seen. So basically about a 25% rise to make way for the 10%. So the HRD ministry says that we should hang on and see the modalities of this, which will be released in about a week's time. Remember, this is uncharted territory for private universities to be creating any kind of quota, so it will all have to be worked out. And we have lots of questions and issues that have been pointed out to us by various experts in the field. But we'll do that point by point and take our audience through it all. So let me just introduce our guest today. We have joining us from Hyderabad, Professor Kancha Ilaya, author, activist, academic. He writes a lot on Dalit issues. We also have in studio Dr. Kaushal Mishra. He's from the organization Youth for Equality. They have challenged the quota system right now. They have been saying they have been pushing the cause of general category students, but they say that this kind of quota in private universities does not work. They've challenged it in the Supreme Court. Joining us from the BJP, we have Lalita Kumaramangalam, and speaking for private universities, we have Madhavi Menon joining us. She is a professor at Ashoka University. Professor Kancha Ilaya, if I can start with one of the first things that people have pointed out, and that is that they say that yes, you are trying to enable students who don't qualify, poorer students, to get into private colleges as well. Until now, private colleges don't have any quotas as such, but they also point out who will pay for them. A lot of the private universities, for example, whether it is Ashoka or anything else, they're very, very expensive education running into lakhs of rupees, any degree upwards of 25 lakh rupees. So what about that? What do you say about that, sir?
No, I carefully read yesterday MHRD minister's statement that first of all this act that they passed for 10% reservation for open category does not talk about private institutions there. It has a major problem there because unless you bring about an act or an ordinance that all private educational institutions will have to implement the reservations, they will not accept it, because it was tried during UPA a period 2006-7 reservation issue, and the private sector opposed very strongly. Finally, Veerappa Moily committee was appointed to oversee and negotiate with the private sector. The private sector straight away rejected. Now, it cannot be implemented only for this 10% without putting the rest of the reservation even in the private sector, SC, ST, OBC reservation there too. So how do they do it? It is very, very unassuming kind of a situation now. How can they do that without any legal process putting on the table?
So you're saying, sir, the amendment is not good enough? That's a legal process? The fact that the constitution has been amended, that's not good enough?
Yeah, the amendment, see, the amendment as of now, like earlier, Article 15 or Article 16 talks about reservations for socially and economically backward classes as well as scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Now they have inserted a section that economically weaker sections will also get educational preferential treatment or reservation, whatever it is. But this does not talk about the private sector. Earlier constitutional position will apply to 10% reservation issue also.
Okay, that's an important point, and perhaps that's why a lot of the people, a lot of the private universities that we approach, vice chancellors of those universities, about what their reaction is, they were hesitant about reacting. Perhaps they're going to wait and watch and see what the government says about what they have to do specifically before they react. But Madhavi Menon, what is your initial reaction as you hear this new initiative being implemented from the very next session?
Well, I'd first like to say that I'm not speaking for private universities. Sure. I think that's rather too grand a title for me. But I'd like to say, there are a couple of things. I think we are running the risk of conflating two separate issues together. I think absolutely college campuses, public and private, have to be as diverse as possible, have to be as diverse as the country itself. Otherwise, we are not doing anybody any justice or any service. So I'm completely in support of diversifying the student demographic. Reservations, however, are a different matter, because reservations in the Constitution, as Professor Ilaiah knows and so admirably has shown all of us, reservations in the Constitution are meant to address historical deprivation that a caste-based country has faced for centuries. And so reservations are specifically to address that kind of caste-based wrongdoing that has happened for hundreds of years. Poverty is not a centuries-old tradition of any kind. Poverty is a state of it's a state that is widespread, unfortunately, in this country especially. But poverty points not to a failure of history, but to a failure of government and society. And so for the government then to invoke a clause that was meant to address historical wrongs, to paper over their own inadequacies of bringing people up from dire poverty, I think is to confuse the issue entirely. Okay. We absolutely want a diverse population, but I don't think reservations are necessarily the way to go about it. For instance, as you mentioned at the beginning, who's going to pay the fees, the high fees for the private universities? Well, we need to have much, much, much more by way of scholarships, for instance. Universities and governments need to target people who want to go to university and pay their fees for them, or give them some 0% loan scholarship. Right. And that's the way to do it. Actually have schemes like MNREGA for the rural poor. Right. You have to have schemes in place, not reservations, which have a very specific historical provenance.
Okay, so till now we've had two issues which perhaps have to be addressed. One is, of course, as Kancha Ilaiah said, what is the thing? How are you going to implement this if private universities are not going to be willing? Many of them might not be willing. And second, who pays for that? And also the parity, which Madhavi Menon you brought up, which one professor actually pointed out to me by saying the example is why they feel that it's unfair is because they say, well, if you gave someone who's a Dalit, if you gave them this quota and you gave them the education, and if you gave someone who's just poor but upper caste the education, the difference between the two is that when one grows up, the upper caste person grows up with that education, they will be able to get a job, they'll perhaps be helped by their own community as well. That might not be the same for the Dalit candidate, and that is what they're saying is the difference. And is the government trying to blur this is the problem that they point out with all of this. Before I go to Lalita Kumar Mangalam, I wanted to ask you, Dr. Mishra, why is it that you oppose, even though you wanted this 10% or you wanted the economic criteria, EWS quota, but why is it you don't want it in private universities?
You have seen it's not a very simple subject currently. This particular bill actually is very confusing and complex. There are few issues. One is reservation, because it is a first initiative by any government that government is shifting from caste based quota to non caste based quota. That is why we are in full support of this criteria, because it does not address and does not stick to a family or caste, it is stick to an individual. It means it is a dynamic criteria. If I am poor today and tomorrow I will become rich, I will not get it.
Right.
So that is why we are supporting the economic concept.
And why are you opposing it?
Let me finish. Okay. And we as a organization Youth for Equality in 2008, 2009, 2012, we have given memorandum to the government, and we have suggested the amendment in the article 15 and bring the economic quota. So that is why we are welcoming. And now question why we are opposing.
Yes.
There is two reasons. One, it is crossing the 50% limit, which is constitutionally wrong, and it will open a big Pandora box. And I have heard by some political parties bringing on the 10th of Feb, they are closing whole India, SC, ST, OBC and minorities coming together on 10th Feb against this, and they want 85% quota for them.
Right.
So it will open a big Pandora box, and it is very difficult for any government to handle it.
And
so that is, and third part is a private institution. Till date, there are two types of private institution. One is aided private institution, one is unaided private institution. This already TMA Pai judgment from the Supreme Court has said that their government cannot put any own policy, independent policy in the private institution. So it becomes constitutionally invalid, and we are opposing it because it is crossing 50% limit.
Okay.
And last thing, because we are not against the poor. It is 10% economic basis, and if it is coming to the education.
So you find it legally untenable?
Legally putting in the private sector and crossing the 50% limit, we are against, but we are in support of economic quota. We welcome it.
So Lalita Kumaramangalam, here you have someone who supports the idea what you're doing, but they're also pointing out that what the opposition like RJD is one party along with the southern parties who are opposing this constitutional amendment that has been brought in, and this quota, EWS quota that has been brought in, and they point out the same thing. What is the legal basis for this? Is it not just an eyewash just by pushing this, which looks like, and more these particular, he's just pointed out another judgment. We've also had the previous judgment as well. He's pointed out the Pai judgment, which points out that this goes against what has been the set path by the Supreme Court.
See, the first thing is that I think it's unfair to use such strong words against the amendment that's just been passed. It's a constitutional amendment that's been passed. The last time when economic reservation, when they tried to introduce it, it wasn't done through the same route. And the government, realizing that, must have consulted some extremely senior constitutional lawyers. I don't think that this time the amendment will not pass the legal litmus test. But let's see what the Supreme Court will say, because as you know, there's already I think a PIL that has been filed.
It's been brought in by him.
Filed in Supreme Court. Now coming to the reservation in education, coming to the reservation in educational institutions, I agree with what Madhaviji said. It's unfair to assume, let me go a little further, it's unfair to assume that people from a particular caste or a creed are the only ones who should have reservation. Now, I agree that while initially the Constitution looked at historical injustice, poverty is also a great injustice, and it's also a huge debilitator. What education gives, especially higher education and good quality education, it gives to a family is literally a leg up, both social and political and in many other ways. Now, money is a very common, whether the lowest or highest is a question of debate in society. And one of the reasons why the government is so keen on also saying that reservations in private institutions must be, or we should at least try to see that it is, that takes place, and they also give place to people from lower income families, is that it's very unfair to assume that a child from a poor family is not as smart or not as clever as a child from a better off family, just because they have not been given that equal opportunity. This is just offering a more even playing field. I agree that implementing it is not going to be easy.
Yes,
it will not be easy at all. But then everything in governance is not always easy.
Right, but ma'am, the thing is, the fact that the government has announced this, even though the previously announced scheme of having a quota for women in IITs, IIT professor says even the resources for that has not been sorted out yet, then should you be announcing a different kind of criteria? Isn't it completely impractical?
When anything new is done, it's called impractical, Sunetra, because there's so much resistance against it.
Okay.
Now, there are many adverbs and adjectives that could be used for this move, but and I don't think it's going to be all done overnight. The effort will be made, yes, certainly. We're trying to see that it's all done immediately, but I don't know if it will take place immediately as fast as any of us want it to. But the fact is that we have to at least take this initiative and make the effort.
Okay, ma'am.
Because without a good quality education, no amount of reservation is really going to work in the long run.
And that quality aspect,
we all know, is the basis of a really, a good life.
Okay, I want to get into that quality aspect which you are raising, but very quickly you wanted to make a point.
Lalita ji, very humbly I am asking you, you have amended the whole constitution on the article 46, which says about weaker section. Kindly read the just above article, article 45. It says free and compulsory quality education to all. Instead of giving reservation, if you follow the article 45, probably the private problem will be solved.
Okay, let's get back to this whole thing of quality education, and that's what I want to ask Professor Kancha Ilaiah. That one of the things is that AICTE, other organizations, they all say they put limits on quality by saying that you only have 60 students per class. You also have other checks. Won't all of this be thrown by this kind of initiative where we have less than 3-4 months for the new session to start, and by these kind of initiatives?
No, see, even last time when they increased over and above 100 to suit 27, and to meet the other general equivalent within that 27, they made 150. That kind of mechanism itself is wrong. Institutions cannot do that. And therefore, JNU at that time asked for double the money that they needed for implementation than what they were getting in the normal budget. Now, what will the private institutions say? In fact, I welcome the 10% with a caveat that yes, the 50% cap has to go, and therefore SC, ST, OBCs will not have any loss. The 10% will be over and above that. Therefore, there should not be any problem, because the Patels, Jats, Gujars were fighting for reservation, and the states should get their own option. But the kind of clauses that they put today are absolutely non-implementable. For example, 8 lakh income, 100 square feet house, 5 acres. Now, what is this criteria? Who will give this certificate? How do they judge? And nothing can be implemented, I'll tell you. This is the biggest mess that ever a government has created, because caste certificate is easy, implementation is possible, it is not changeable in generation. But
Okay.
economic criteria
Yeah.
is going to pull down every institution.
Yes.
It's not possible. Quality question.
Yeah.
We have been asking that if you implement English medium and one regional language across the board from LKG to 12, after 25 years, stop all reservations. We don't need it. We don't need it. But
Okay.
you have the private sector English medium, even in this 10%, I'll tell you, Brahmins, Vaishyas, Kayasthas and Khatris will get all 10%, even on the poverty basis.
Wow.
Shudras cannot come into that because they are not in the English base.
Wow.
Professor,
Okay. Yeah.
Professor, I want to reply you. It's
That is the fact.
Professor. it-
Patels, Gujars.
Yes, sir. He
No,
has a
no,
question
no
for you.
people can come
Dr.
into
Mishra
that.
has a question for you,
Professor,
Kajal. Yeah. Very quick.
You are always looking
Yeah,
this,
tell me.
our country in the basis of
Let him
Brahman,
ask, yeah.
Thakur, Vaishya and Shudra. That is our problem. If because everybody knows that reservation is meant only for untouchables. And
But
you,
what is this
professor
caste?
like
Why
you,
did BJP go for
professor
that?
like you, who is a social
but
scientist, who is
remember,
so much eminent
even in
professor,
this-
and he
even in
himself
this-
has not
No,
opposed the
Dr.
OBC
Mishra,
reservation.
Dr. Mishra, are you
No, no,
denying
Mishra,
that they're
listen.
discriminated, that they're historically discriminated? Are you denying
The
that?
Prime
Yes.
Minister himself
Because-
said
yes,
as an OBC.
I will prove it.
Okay, we don't have
The
time
Prime
to get into
Minister
No, no, no,
historical
I-
discrimination.
said that
No, no,
as
because,
OBC went to the
because no
election.
scientific data. I am asking
The
Professor
BJP
Kancha Ilaya.
is talking about
Show me
caste
any
today.
scientific
Okay,
detail
what
which
why?
says that they
Kancha
have
Ilaya has brought up
discriminated
a
for
totally different
every
issue
time
that we
whenever
need
TV
more
programs
time to
come,
discuss.
everybody says
I
it's
don't think,
thousands
I think
here.
that's
It's
a completely,
thousands here.
That's
It's
a
not.
completely different debate,
Yes.
and also our, the father of the
without
Constitution, B.R.
discrimination,
Ambedkar, has
why all
written about
this?
it
Yes,
lots of times.
it
Okay,
is.
But
Madhvi
it's
Menon-
never thousands
Okay,
here.
that's
Why
going
all
to a
this?
completely
Poor
different
must
debate.
also be
Okay,
included,
Professor.
and it should not matter what caste or creed they're
Okay,
from.
no. Okay,
Or what
we
gender.
don't want to get into that right now. Madhvi Menon, what, according to you, is the most biggest practical problem in implementing what the government has ordered?
Well, I think the biggest practical problem is also the biggest political problem, is also the biggest rhetorical problem, which is if you are saying that you're invested in quality education in this country,
Yeah.
and you expect people not to laugh after what this government has done, gone after educational institutions, brought JNU to its knees, filed sedition charges against youth leaders, are cutting down on freedom of speech and freedom of expression, cutting down on campus space
But
as
is
a
that
space
related
of freedom
to
of
this?
ideas.
Okay.
That is not quality education. And then suddenly you say, I want to do this to produce quality education. It is an absolute eyewash. So we are all very invested as professors in
Okay.
quality education. We are also very invested in social justice.
So,
What we
Lalita
are not
Kumaramangalam,
invested
you've
in-
heard what Madhavi Menon said and what Kancha Ilaya said. We have the last minute. What would you say that, this major education
in every
initiative?
issue,
Yeah.
Sunita, in every issue there is politics. Now, I'm not willing to get into the political yeses and noes and into a shouting match on any program, in fact. But Professor Madhavi has the right to her own opinions. I may not agree with them at all, but she has the right to her own opinions. But I feel, coming back to the reservation thing, that I do not know why the poor should be discriminated against. I agree. Dalits have been discriminated against, and many other so-called lower castes. But then I don't believe in the caste system myself at all. I may be saying something that is totally, anathema to a lot of people in this country. But the fact is that this is more about poor versus rich. The better heeled people anywhere in the world have access to better quality education.
Okay.
And everybody should be, at least have a chance to access that sort of education.
Okay.
People dream of studying in many higher education institutions
that
they don't get a chance to go to.
Sure.
With regard to how it's going to be financed, I think Professor Madhavi said that we need to have a lot more scholarships, financial inclusion, etc. All
Well,
of that.
how
yes.
it's going to be
But
financed isn't the
ultimately,
only
without
question. It's
good
also how the
education,
modalities
it's
of it.
impossible for societies or families
Right.
to come up.
Right, ma'am. Yeah, thanks very much
I think
on
that
that.
has to
But
be worked out. That can't be discussed on a program like that. But
sure.
yes, that I think
one
that
of the
will
things,
be
of
worked
course,
out.
what we are
Should be
forgetting
worked
is
out
that if you
beforehand,
increase the seats by 25%,
Just one question.
as one professor pointed out, it means that you have to, for an IIT, it means creating a quarter of another IIT, which is humongous amount of resources are needed. And do we have the capacity to do that and yet maintain the quality of IIMs and others in just a short while? And at the end of it, how many students will really be able to take advantage, especially when you look at the private educational institutes, Can they do that without getting the scholarship or not? These are some of the questions. We hope you, the policymakers who are about to announce that, they take into account all these kind of loopholes and problems and challenges that we pointed out. Thanks to all my guests here on Reality Check. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.